long time ago, and I have never lost my enthusiasm for this subject. My goal as your professor and guide in this class is to inform you and to amaze you about the most incredible organ in the human body. Now, since it has not always been believed that the brain was responsible or important even for perception and cognition, we need to begin with a historical introduction to see why it was decided that the brain is actually the biological substrate of the mind. And there's another reason why we start with a historical introduction. Neuroscience is and always has been an eclectic field, formulating and refining theories that come from experimental research, but also borrowing ideas, historically, especially from other fields like philosophy. So in this first lecture, we can only touch briefly and superficially on the historical antecedents of modern neuroscience and on some of the most important of the paradigm shifts which have occurred from antiquity to present in our thinking about how the mind, the soul, and the brain are related. So let's begin with ancient civilizations. Ancient civilizations believed that the heart was the seat of perception, which is our ability to perceive an external world, also the seat of cognition, which is our ability to think, and also the soul. So the heart was seen as the seat of perception, cognition, and the soul. Records from ancient Egypt, and we're so fortunate to have written records from this culture. These records indicate that sometime around about 1000 BC, when pharaohs and others that were deemed worthy of embalming died, they had their brains extracted through the nose and discarded. So the brain wasn't seen as anything, an organ that was important at all. And in fact, the organs that would be seen as vital to the afterlife, and these would include the liver, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines, were often preserved in beautiful alabaster canopic jars. Now, the heart, on the other hand, was believed to be the seat of the mind and the soul of the individual, and thus it was of ultimate importance. The heart was actually left in place to be mummified with the body. The pharaoh could enter the afterlife without a brain, but not without a heart. Now, the significance of the heart is also evidenced by rituals that surrounded the entrance of the individual to the afterlife. So in Ani's Book of the Dead, we see Anubis, who was the jackal-headed god of internment and also the guardian of the sarcophagus. He led the dead to judgment. And one of the images in Ani's book is of Anubis holding the balance. And on one scale is the individual's heart. And on the other scale is the feather of Mot. And Mot was the goddess of truth, justice, and order in the universe. And in order for that individual to enter the afterlife, their sins, as judged by that heart, had to weigh less than the feather of Mot. And these beliefs were not unique to the Egyptians, it turns out. Other ancient cultures around the Mediterranean, for example, the Greeks, but also other great civilizations in India and China, likewise held the heart to be the organ and seat of perception, intellect, memory, emotions, and the spirit or the soul of the individual. For example, Aristotle. Aristotle would influence science and philosophy for centuries, and he firmly believed that it was the heart that was the seat of cognition and perception. In his philosophical system, the brain's only function was to cool the passions of the heart. So it was the heart that was the seat of the important functions of perception, cognition, and the soul. Later, Galen, a Greek physician in Rome, who at different times in his career was a physician to emperors like Marcus Aurelius, but also to gladiators, rejected Aristotle's belief that the heart was the seat of the soul and mind, but he actually didn't let go of the idea that the soul and mind consisted of spirits that emanated from the heart. This was a time in which people were thinking about spirits or fluids that moved around in the body, a sort of hydraulic view of the body. And so Galen thought that spirits were a part of the person emanating from the heart. To Galen, the role of the brain was to make these spirits noble in human beings. So the function of the brain was to make these spirits noble. And Galen's ideas and theories, or variations on them, were to dominate into the Renaissance. In the Renaissance and after, the soul and mind became localized, if not always to the brain substance itself, at least in the head. So one of the earliest theories was that perception, memory, and other cognitive functions resided in cavities in the brain, which are called ventricles. So if your mother told you once that you had holes in your head, she was actually right. Now, this is a modern view of the ventricular system of the brain. This is our brain from the side. This would be the front of our brains. This is the back of our brain. And this area shows a ventricular system, basically cavities or holes in the brain that are part of the ventricles. And so many of the individuals in the Renaissance believed, in fact, that this was the seat of the mind and the soul. One of the main proponents of this theory that perception and cognition and the soul were located in the ventricular system was the quintessential Renaissance genius Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci gave us some of the most beautiful, detailed, and accurate depictions of the ventricular system of the brain. And he believed that perception and cognition resided in these cavities, not in the brain substance itself. Now, again, we see this idea of spirits. And I sort of like this, better to think of spirits not moving around just in general, but to think of those spirits moving in the cavities of the brain, these holes that were in the brain. It's not really so far-fetched to think that. Now, there have been many philosophical influences on modern neuroscience. This is a subject in and of itself. But surely one of the most influential of the philosophers was the 17th century French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes. His name has practically become synonymous with the idea of dualism. And dualism is basically a belief that the mind and the body are distinct entities. They're independent and they're different in nature. They're made up of a different type of substance. There were actually many antecedents to this idea that mind and body were distinct and different. But I think the idea was most elaborated by Descartes, and that's why he's most associated with it. He spoke of the bodies of animals and humans as being like clockworks, just machines that were driven by biological processes. But he believed that the mind or the soul, and again, these terms are used interchangeably, almost like the mind and soul is a single entity. He referred to it as such. He called it the rational soul. So the mind, perception, cognition, and the soul are the special property of the individual. He called the rational soul and thought of it as one thing. He felt that this could be found only in humans and could not be accounted for in terms of biology. Now, what is more important probably for our discussion here is that Descartes recognized that bodies of humans function similar to animals. He believed that the rational soul, however, was responsible for this perception and cognition, for our subjective sense of the world and ourselves, and for our essential spirit. Descartes could not imagine how we could perceive an external world, how we could think. His famous dictum, I think, therefore I am. he could not see how that could simply be a quality of our physical bodies. And that's why he had to postulate the rational soul. Nonetheless, Descartes clearly understood that somehow the rational soul and the body had to interact. So when a person made a moral judgment, for example, about something that changed their action in the world, clearly the morality, he thought, was a part of the rational soul, but it changed the actions of the body. So Descartes became interested in looking where there might be a place where the soul and the body might interact. And he identified the pineal as that place in the body. So the pineal is a single, unpaired structure in the brain, and he believed it was the seat of the rational soul and the structure through which the spirit or soul could influence the material body. Now, I found an image for you. This is a section through the brain that's been stained. It's cut in this plane, so it goes from the front of the brain to the rear of the brain. And you can see that the pineal is this single, unpaired structure right here. Now, there's a reason why Descartes was interested in finding one unpaired structure in the brain. And this, too, is very logical in some meaningful way. Experience of the world and our experience of ourselves seems to be unitary. So Descartes reasoned that there had to be a single place that wasn't paired, and most structures in the body and the brain are paired. There had to be a single place where the rational soul interacted, and he chose the pineal from that. More interestingly, however, for me, or more incredible, I'm surprised that Descartes didn't notice, because they certainly had done dissections in animals, didn't seem to notice that animals also have a pineal gland. And he didn't believe that animals had a rational soul, yet they had a pineal, and I don't know how he worked through that one in his system. We now know that the pineal is the main gland that produces melatonin in the brain and is involved in sleep-wake cycles. Now, later in the 17th century and beyond, individual scientists, physicians, philosophers actually increasingly began to believe that the brain was responsible for many of the functions that had been previously attributed to a soul. So one of the more important of these individuals was Thomas Willis. Thomas Willis was an English anatomist and physician. He coined the term neurology and became the father of neurology, the field of medicine involved specifically with disorders of the brain. As an interesting aside here and piece of trivia related to neuroscience, Thomas Willis was one of the leaders of a dynamic group of individuals who happened to be at Oxford at the time, and they're referred to as the Oxford Group. And this consisted of physicians, of philosophers, of individuals who contributed enormously to chemistry and physics later on. For example, Willis, but also Robert Boyle, Robert Hooke, the philosopher John Locke, who is more remembered for his ideas and beliefs in the natural rights of man and how he influenced the United States Constitution. Few people realize that John Locke was a physician, and he was part of this dynamic Oxford group, incredible group of intellectuals who contributed much to our understanding of early science. Another individual who was part of this group was an individual named Christopher Wren. Christopher Wren, of course, being more well known for his having been the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral. And so this is an individual who was part of this Oxford group. Willis was one of the first individuals to describe many neurologic and psychiatric disorders. In 1664, he published The Anatomy of the Brain and Nerves. And this book helped establish that perception, movement, cognition, memory were all functions of the brain substance itself. Now, what is interesting in this regard is his observations were actually accompanied by beautiful and detailed anatomical drawings that were made by Christopher Wren, again, our great architect who went on to design St. Paul's Cathedral in London. This is one of Wren's drawings that is in Willis's book, and it shows the ventral or undersurface of the brain. It could be used today to teach medical students. It is so accurate. Just a really dynamic group of men at Oxford at that time. Now, even a superficial history of neuroscience would not be complete without the mention of Franz Joseph Gall. He clearly believed that the brain was the organ of the mind. He would postulate that there were approximately 35 mental faculties, so to speak, that were located in the cortex. Moreover, he would postulate that the development of these various faculties would cause a change in the shape of the skull so that you could actually tell whether someone had a particular type of quality or faculty that was extremely well developed. So when you look at the maps from these times, by the way, this was formalized in the field of phrenology. So you can localize various types of characteristics on the skull. This is a little bust, a little head of phrenology. And here is, right here on the top here is where benevolence is located. So Gall believed that if you were a particularly benevolent person, then that area and the skull above it would become extraordinarily developed. You would be able to tell this by feeling the individual's head. The shape of the skull would reflect this. Now, we may have abandoned many of these ideas that Gall put forth. Certainly we've abandoned phrenology. So we no longer think that the shape of someone's skull tells us something fundamental about the qualities of that person. But I think it's really important that you should know that in modern neuroscience, we actually have found that some very complex functions, for example, something like empathy and compassion, actually have sites in the brain that are pretty much devoted to those faculties. So while we've thrown out the idea that the shape of the skull is going to help us know whether someone is benevolent, I think it's probably best to look at the person's behavior. But nonetheless, we have in fact uncovered in modern neuroscience many very complex faculties that are governed by the brain. Now, after Gall's death, his ideas would be challenged by many individuals who actually would provide the experimental foundation for modern neuroscience. Many of these individuals were biologists or psychologists who would do experiments where they might remove part of an animal's brain and then see what function was lost. By today's standards, these experiments are very, very crude. But in fact, very similar experiments are used now to determine the same thing. Our experimental techniques have improved. We don't take out huge areas of the brain. Generally, we take out a very small area of the brain, but we still use this basic type of method to help us understand the function and the connections of various areas of the brain. Now, this very brief introduction can't possibly do justice to all of the individuals who have contributed to our understanding of the brain. In particular, throughout history, there have been physicians who during times of war have kept incredibly detailed journals that have told us so much about the organization of the human brain. They kept journals where they detailed what kind of function was lost in a soldier when they sustained certain injuries to the brain. These are fascinating reading, but it's because individuals wrote such journals has given us insight into the function of the human brain. And I believe we owe a particular homage to individuals in philosophy who from antiquity to present have asked the questions which are only now being addressed by neuroscience. What do we know of the world in which we exist, and how do we know it? What is the mind? What is consciousness? These and other questions are still central to both philosophy and to neuroscience, although they're framed differently in each of the fields for obvious reasons. For example, a philosopher might ask, what are the categories of mind that exist and limit our understanding of the world as we know it? A neuroscientist might address the same question but would frame it slightly differently. A neuroscientist who approached this question would be interested in determining the underlying neural circuits involved in the processing of sensory information so that we could gain an understanding about how we learn about an external world through our senses. So the neuroscientist would frame it slightly different, but they might conclude that all we know of the external world is what the brain allows because of those underlying neural circuits. Now, in the modern era, the brain is seen as the biological substrate of the mind. The mind is now seen as that internal subjective sense that we have of our experience. The current working paradigm is actually captured beautifully by the quote I gave by Simon LeVay at the beginning of the overall scopes for this course. The mind is just the brain doing its job. So to summarize briefly, and to highlight the major paradigm shifts in our thinking about how mind, soul, and brain are related to each other. This is what has brought us to this point, and that's why it's important to appreciate this historical perspective. According to the earliest records, the brain was irrelevant to cognition, perception, and other qualities of the mind, and also irrelevant to the soul. It was the heart in these ancient cultures that was given the central role as the seat of the mind and the seat of the soul. So we also saw in this brief introduction that historically the terms mind and soul were used almost interchangeably. It was as though the soul and the mind were a single entity. Our ability to perceive the world and to think was tied up with this uniqueness we had, this spirit that made us an individual, this soul that we had as part of a unique part of being a human being. Later, the historical change, the paradigm shift, was that perception and cognition were now seen as separate from the soul. And perception and cognition became attributed to the mind. And this mind now was separate from this unique quality called the soul. And finally, to our modern era, where the brain is seen as the biological substrate of the mind. It is precisely the question as to how the brain gives rise to the mind that is the focus of much of the neuroscience research and inquiry. Not to mention, it's also open to a lot of speculation. Neuroscience does not address and cannot address questions related to whether there's a soul, whether there's some kind of quality present in humans that survives the death of the brain and the death of the body. The emphasis for us in modern neuroscience is going to be how the brain and ultimately the mind are related. Now, I should like to end this brief introductory lecture with a quote that I think just encapsulates beautifully the modern view of the brain. Men ought to know that from nothing else but the brain come joys, delights, laughter and sports, and sorrows, griefs, despondency, and lamentations. And by this, in an especial manner, we acquire wisdom and knowledge, and see and hear, and know what are foul and what are fair, what are bad and what are good, what are sweet and what are unsavory. And by the same organ, we become mad and delirious, and fears and terrors assail us. All these things we endure from the brain. And while this sounds remarkably contemporary, it's going to demonstrate to us that there have always been individuals who have been able to be way ahead of their times. This quote is actually taken from On the Sacred Disease, which was written in the 5th century BC by our father of medicine, Hippocrates. Thank you.